This is where we take a whole stack of sources and boil them down to what you really need to know, skipping the noise. And today, we're doing just that. We're taking a close look at the Trump administration's deportation policies. It's a topic that's, well, constantly in the headlines and has deeply affected so many communities. Our mission today really is to unpack all the complexities. We want to look at public opinion, what people think, examine the reality of the enforcement efforts, what's actually happening, and try to understand the far-reaching consequences, socioeconomically and, of course, humanitarily. Think of this as, your way to get genuinely well-informed on this really intricate issue, moving past the simple headlines. We're using a big report called Deportation Nation, Policy, Public Opinion, and Consequences, plus some recent CBS News and CNN polls to guide us. Okay, let's unpack this and dive into the material. So first off, how did this administration fundamentally approach immigration? What was the big picture?
Well, the Trump administration's approach, broadly speaking, was really characterized by a commitment to very stringent enforcement and also a significant reduction in overall immigration numbers.
Okay, stringent enforcement, reducing numbers. What were the key objectives then?
They were pretty clear from the start. Substantially increasing deportations was a major one, enhancing border security, obviously, and also restricting access to pretty much all forms of immigration relief.
Right, and we saw examples like the push for the expanded border wall and that zero tolerance policy at the border. Very visible stuff.
Exactly. Those were very public manifestations of that overall strategy.
And there was a key piece of legislation that sort of put all this into law, right? The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA, signed July 4th, 2025. What made that so foundational? And can you give us a sense of the scale, the money involved?
Oh, it's absolutely pivotal. The OBBBA, it allocates an unprecedented amount, $170.7 billion. That's billion with a B.
Wow.
Yes, specifically for immigration and border enforcement over just 4 years, running through September 2029.
$170.7 billion. Where did that break down?
So $45 billion was earmarked just for detention facilities, another $32 billion for sort of broader enforcement and deportation operations, and then a really substantial $47 billion specifically for border wall construction.
That's a staggering amount of money, more than the GDP of some countries.
It really is. It's a massive financial commitment. And what's also fascinating here is how the name itself, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, became this sort of battleground.
Oh, so?
Well, the official naming was clearly intended to project a positive image, right? But critics, like the National Immigration Law Center, they quickly characterized it as, quote, tragically misnamed. They argued its outcomes would actually be quite detrimental. It highlights this crucial fight over narrative control in policy debates.
So the OBBBA laid the groundwork financially and structurally. But it wasn't just one bill, was it? It was a combination of policies that created this aggressive stance. What else was critical?
Absolutely. Beyond OBBA, you had the zero tolerance approach we mentioned, rolled out back in 2018. That mandated prosecuting undocumented immigrants caught at the border. That was a huge shift.
Right.
Then there was the suspension of most asylum applications, which drastically limited who could even seek protection here. And the termination of temporary protected status, TPS, for many immigrants, that stripped legal protections from people who lived here for years.
And looking forward, there's this Project 2025 initiative. It brings up something really striking, using the Alien Enemies Act of 1798.
Yeah.
That sounds ancient. What's that about?
It does sound ancient because it is. It's a rarely invoked wartime authority. Project 2025 proposes using it to allow the president, potentially, to detain or deport non-citizens without a hearing.
Without a hearing?
Yes, based solely on their country of birth or citizenship if there's a time of war or a declared national emergency. It raises really significant questions about legal strategy, civil liberties, and potentially bypassing established due process for deportations, a very old law being considered for modern use.
Okay, so it's clear the administration had a very comprehensive, very aggressive strategy. How did the public react to all this? Because this is where you said it gets interesting, maybe counterintuitive. What do the polls actually show?
Yeah, public opinion is definitely complex here. Often contradictory, Overall, there's this mix of negative sentiment alongside really deep partisan polarization.
Okay, break that down. What are the numbers?
So a Pew Research Center survey, this was June 2025, found 47% disapproved of the administration's overall immigration approach. That was versus 42% who approved. And Gallup data from that same month also showed majority disapproval.
Disapproval edging out approval overall, but you mentioned polarization.
Big time. That same Pew poll. 78% of Republicans approved, 51% strongly approved, but 81% of Democrats disapproved, with 63% strongly disapproved.
Huge gap.
Massive. And Gallup backed this up. 85% approval among Republicans, but only 28% among independents and just 2% among Democrats. Basically, support for the deportation policy is heavily concentrated in the Republican and Medjugorje base, not so much with moderate voters.
Okay, so it's not just split, but there seems to be a trend, right? You mentioned CBS and CNN polling showing declining support over time, especially for the deportation program itself.
Exactly. CBS News polling about 6 months into the second term showed support for Trump's deportation program at 49%. Now, that sounds like a lot, but it was actually down 5 points from the month before and 10 points down from February.
Noticeable drop.
Yeah, and overall disapproval of his handling of immigration hit 56%, which was a 10-point increase in disapproval from March. CNN polling echoed this. 55% thought he'd gone too far, and that was up 10 points since February.
So a growing number of people, maybe outside that core base, are feeling it's too much.
That seems to be the trend. Just 15% of Republican-aligned adults said Trump had gone too far, but compare that to 90% of Democratic-aligned adults who felt that way. It really highlights that divide.
Now, this is fascinating, too. Against this backdrop of intense policy, Americans' preferences for overall immigration rates shifted quite dramatically. You mentioned the number wanting decreased immigration nearly halved.
It's a really significant trend. The percentage wanting decreased immigration dropped from 55% in 2024 down to just 30% by June 2025.
Well, from over half to less than a third.
Exactly. And now 38% prefer current levels and 26% actually want an increase. And you see this record high 79% of Americans viewing immigration as generally beneficial for the country.
So what's going on there, especially among Republicans, where the desire for less immigration also dropped significantly? Is it that satisfaction effect you mentioned?
That's one interpretation, yeah. It suggests that for some Republicans, the administration's very tough stance might have made them feel like, okay, our concerns are being addressed, so there's less urgency to demand even further cuts. It's like the policy for them achieved its goal, even if the broader public isn't fully on board.
Okay, so that's overall sentiment. What about specific enforcement measures? How do people feel about, say, using local police for deportations or ICE raids?
It's a real mixed bag on specifics. Using state and local law enforcement for deportations, almost perfectly split, 50% approval, 49% disapproval. Offering funds for people to leave voluntarily, same thing. 49% approve, 50% disapprove.
So those are divisive. What about things like asylum or TPS?
There, you see clearer disapproval from the majority. Suspending most asylum applications, 60% disapproved. Ending TPS, 59% disapproved. Increasing ICE raids on workplaces, 54% disapproved.
Okay.
And even deporting people to prisons in other countries like El Salvador, 61% disapproved of that.
But again, despite that overall disapproval, Republican support for these specific things stayed strong.
Very strong. For example, 81% of Republicans approved of using state and local law enforcement. 76% approved of increased workplace raids. So the base remained largely supportive of the tools being used.
What about the border wall? That's always been such a central symbol. Did support shift there?
Interestingly, yes. Support for expanding the U.S.-Mexico border wall actually went up to 56% from 46% back in 2019.
Up, even with disapproval on other measures.
Yeah, and part of that increase is attributed to shifts even among some Democrats. 27% of them supported it. It suggests that border security as a concept might have a sort of distinct appeal, maybe cutting across some of the other divides.
And what about demographics? Did different groups view these policies differently, say by ethnicity or age?
Definitely. Hispanic and Black Americans generally showed deep skepticism, low approval across most measures. Asian Americans were a bit more varied. Majorities actually approved of using state local law enforcement, that was 58%, and offering funds for self-deportation, 59%.
Interesting variability there. And age.
A big difference. Older adults, say 50 plus, were significantly more approving of things like using state and local law enforcement, 58% approval, compared to only around 40% for those under 50.
And that age gap exists even within the Republican Party.
It does, yeah, which might indicate a sort of generational difference in how these policies land, even within the same party.
Let's talk economics and crime perceptions. How do people think these policies would affect the economy or crime rates?
On the economy, more people expected a negative outcome. 46% thought the economy would get weaker because of these policies, and 53% expected them to cost taxpayers more. Highly partisan views here, as you'd expect.
Right. And crime.
A bit more split.
Yeah.
41% expected less crime as a result of the policies, while 37% thought there'd be little impact. But again, huge partisan difference. 75% of Republicans believed the policies would lead to less crime.
And this connects back to something you mentioned earlier, the gap between rhetoric, especially about criminal aliens, and the actual data on deportees records.
Exactly. If we look at the bigger picture, that discrepancy is stark. The public perception, particularly among Republicans, that mass deportations mean less crime, seems heavily influenced by political messaging rather than the available data.
Because the data shows.
The data shows that while many deportees might be labeled convicted criminals, the vast majority of those convictions are for things like traffic offenses or immigration violations themselves. Serious criminal convictions, like for homicide or sex offenses, make up a very, very small percentage, like 0.58% for homicide, 1.8% for sex offenses in one sample.
So a disconnect between the worst of the worst narrative and the reality for most people being deported.
A significant disconnect, yes, which suggests a deliberate effort to shape public opinion to maintain support.
So beyond approving or disapproving of the policies, how did the public feel about how the deportations were being carried out, the approach itself?
Well, half of Americans, 50%, believed the administration's approach was too careless. Meanwhile, 39% thought it was about right.
And I assume that also broke down along party lines.
Sharply. 81% of Democrats said it was too careless, but 69% of Republicans felt it was about right.
And that perception of carelessness likely comes from all the reporting on humanitarian impacts, right? Family separations, targeting people without violent records. It suggests people care about how enforcement happens, not just that it happens.
Precisely. It highlights public sensitivity to the methods and the human costs, not just the overarching policy goals.
Okay, so we've got the policy framework, the complex public reaction. Let's shift now to the actual numbers, the deportation trends, the targets. What does this ramp up actually look like in practice?
Right, let's put it in context. Historically, President Obama actually holds the record for the highest number of formal removals, around 3 million. Then Clinton with about 2 million, George W. Bush around 870,000.
And Trump's first term.
Trump's first term saw about 1.2 million removals. So lower than Obama and Clinton, but higher than Bush.
Okay, but you mentioned a shift in where enforcement happens. Less interior, more border.
Exactly. Over the last 15 years or so, interior removals by ICE, meaning arrests away from the border, have actually trended down from about 155,000 a year between FY 2009 and 2016, down to like 38,000 a year between FY 2021 and 2024.
That's a big drop.
It is. But conversely, border removals have shot up substantially, reaching 224,000 in FY 2024. It clearly reflects a strategic shift in resources towards trying to deter border crossings, especially with high arrival numbers.
Okay, so that's the context. But the Trump administration's goals for the second term were much higher, weren't they? That 1 million deportations a year target.
Extremely ambitious targets, yes. Consistently aiming for 1 million deportations annually. That's a huge leap from the historical average of, 300,000 to 330,000 a year. And they requested major funding increases to try and support that.
Have they been hitting those numbers? What do the recent figures show?
Well, in the first 100 days of the second term, ICE reported arresting about 66,500 undocumented individuals and removing roughly 65,700. That figure later climbed past 207,000 removed.
So significant numbers, but maybe not on pace for 1 million a year quite yet.
Not quite on that million a year pace initially, but the internal goals were definitely aggressive. ICE initially aimed for 1,500 to 2,000 arrests per day. That was later up to 3,000 daily. And there was even talk from a special advisor about potentially reaching 7,000 arrests a day.
7,000 a day. That's an incredible scale.
It represents a massive operational ramp-up.
And again, linking back to the public messaging versus reality, the focus was often on criminal illegal aliens and interior enforcement. But the data suggested otherwise.
Right. While the public talk emphasized interior enforcement and criminals, looking closely at who was actually deported showed that divergence. We mentioned that estimate of 100,000 deported early on. Around 70,000 were categorized as convicted criminals.
Okay, that sounds like a lot.
It does, but the key is what they were convicted of. The majority were less severe things, traffic violations or immigration offenses themselves. Very few, relatively speaking, had those serious felony convictions that were often highlighted.
So again, that narrative shaping seems crucial to understanding the policy's support.
Absolutely. It appears to be a deliberate effort to frame the policy in a way that maximizes public acceptance, even if the reality on the ground is broader.
Okay, let's get into how these enhanced policies are implemented. We know the goals, the targets. What are the actual mechanisms?
Well, a huge part is that OBBBA funding we talked about earlier. That $45 billion for detention, $32 billion for enforcement that provides the resources to scale up.
Right, the money.
Then you have specific policies like zero tolerance from 2018 that directly cause the separation of at least 5,569 children from their parents. A huge number. And the tracking was so poor that reunification became incredibly difficult. Over 1,000 kids were still separated as of late 2023.
Just heartbreaking.
Truly. And then add the suspension of most asylum claims, ending TPS Project 2025, even advocates repealing all TPS designations. And of course, that potential use of the Alien Enemies Act we discussed, which could bypass hearings altogether in certain situations. It's a multi-pronged approach.
So the OBBBA funding allows for expanded detention. That $45 billion, what does that translate to in terms of capacity? How many people are we talking about?
That funding could push ICE's annual detention budget up to at least $14 billion. That's a 311% increase over FY 2024.
300%.
Yeah. And estimates suggest that could support detaining up to 116,000 individuals by 2029. That includes building new soft-sided camps, basically. Temporary, often tent-like facilities.
Then more agents, too.
Yes, the bill funds aiming for 10,000 new ICE agents to try and hit that million-a-year deportation goal. They're even offering $10,000 bonuses per agent, which raises concerns about potentially lowering recruitment standards to meet the hiring targets.
And military involvement.
There's $1 billion in the OBBA specifically to divert military resources towards border militarization. This brings up concerns about the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally bars the military from domestic law enforcement roles.
Wow. So it's not just agents in beds. There are also these controversial data tactics being used, right? Like accessing Medicaid data. How does that work?
Yeah, this is a really significant development. ICE officials were granted access to personal data for 79 million Medicaid enrollees.
79 million. Including citizens.
Yes, potentially including citizens.
Yeah.
The data includes home addresses, birth dates, ethnicities, social security numbers. It comes from an agreement between CMS and the Medicare-Medicaid Agency and DHS, and it's explicitly for deportation purposes.
That seems extraordinary. Has there been pushback?
Oh, huge pushback. Lawmakers, governors, 20 states actually sued, arguing it violates federal health privacy laws like IPAY. Critics call it an extraordinary disclosure and worry it will create widespread fear.
Fear of what, exactly?
Fear that everyday places, schools, hospitals, churches become risky, that immigrants and maybe even citizens caught in the mix will avoid necessary medical care or interacting with institutions because they fear being targeted or swept up in a raid.
A chilling effect. And what about local police? Are they playing a bigger role too?
A much bigger role. The OBBA sets aside at least $14 billion just to reimburse state and local governments for partnering on immigration enforcement.
Through programs like 287G.
Exactly. The 287G program, which basically deputizes local officers to act as immigration agents, has reportedly increased six-fold since January. It effectively doubles ICE's deportation force on the ground.
And the concerns there are about?
Concerns from advocacy groups are mainly about incentivizing racial profiling and potential abuses by local police. Plus, the rapid expansion of detention, like that camp in Florida built in just 8 days for 3,000 people, raises serious questions about humane conditions.
And there are proposals to go even further.
Yes. Former President Trump has talked about reassigning federal agents from other duties, deputizing more local police and even National Guard troops, and potentially invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy the military domestically for immigration enforcement. It points towards further militarization.
So if we step back and connect all these dots, the funding, the policies, the enforcement mechanisms, the consequences seem profound. Let's talk about those socioeconomic and humanitarian impacts. What does this mean for families, for kids?
The impact on families is devastating. These mass deportation policies put nearly 5 million families at risk of being broken up. Just since 2011, over 400,000 parents of U.S. citizen children have been deported.
400,000 parents of citizens.
Yeah. And in 2018, about 5.2 million kids in the U.S. had at least one unauthorized immigrant parent. 85% of those kids are U.S. citizens themselves.
So the impact ripples out far beyond the person deported.
Absolutely. We saw the trauma from the zero tolerance separation studies showed basically 100% of those kids exhibited PTSD symptoms. The parents suffer long-term trauma too, and child detention itself is harmful. A Harvard study found mental and physical harm in kids detained in ICE centers, often held way longer than the legal limit under the Flores Agreement.
And the OBBA actually allows for indefinite family detention.
It explicitly approves it, yes, and funds things like intrusive physical exams for unaccompanied children. For the estimated 20 million people living in mixed-status households, Trump's proposed mass deportation plan could be catastrophic, potentially cutting average household income almost in half, pushing many families into poverty.
Okay, let's switch to the economic side. What happens if you suddenly remove millions of workers from the economy?
Well, you'd likely see severe labor shortages pretty quickly, especially in sectors that rely heavily on immigrant labor. Think agriculture, construction, hospitality, which likely means higher prices for everyone. Projections estimate that deporting 4 million people over 4 years could lead to 3.3 million fewer employed immigrants, but also 2.6 million fewer employed U.S.-born workers due to the economic disruption.
So it affects native-born workers too.
Significantly. The construction sector could lose almost 900,000 U.S.-born jobs and 1.4 million immigrant jobs, maybe 500,000 childcare jobs gone. States with large immigrant populations would obviously feel the biggest hit.
What about things like Social Security? Don't unauthorized workers pay into that?
They do. An estimated $24 billion in Social Security taxes in 2024. Deporting them is projected to cut Social Security revenue by $133 billion over 10 years.
That's a big hole.
A huge hole. And over 30 years, it could be nearly $884 billion less revenue, which would actually speed up the depletion of the Social Security Trust Fund by about 6 months.
And then there's the sheer cost of carrying out these deportations. You mentioned the OBBBA funding, but what are the overall cost projections?
Experts estimate a one-time cost of at least $315 billion just for the logistics, arrest, detention, legal processing, removal for over 12 million people.
$315 billion one time.
Yeah, and then sustaining an operation aiming for 1 million deportations a year. That's estimated at roughly $88 billion annually. Over a decade, you're looking at almost $968 billion.
Almost $1 trillion over 10 years.
Close to it. And despite that massive spending, less than 8% of the OBBA funding is actually designated for immigration court processing, which is already hugely backlogged.
It really makes you think, like you said, when people see ICE raids happening and they know tens of billions are being spent, they might ask, how exactly is this helping me?
It's a valid question about priorities and return on investment, certainly.
Beyond the economics, what about healthcare access and broader civil liberties concerns?
Well, the OBBBA directly restricts access to health and nutrition programs, even for lawfully present immigrants. Things like federally funded Medicaid, Medicare, ACA marketplace plans, SNAP benefits. It also cuts Medicaid funding to states and hospitals for providing emergency services.
So hitting healthcare access and civil liberties.
Big concerns there. Aggressive enforcement inevitably raises risks of racial profiling, potential warrantless arrests, and even the wrongful detention of U.S. citizens or legal residents. History shows immigration enforcement often involves racial and ethnic profiling, disproportionately hitting non-white communities. The American Bar Association specifically notes Black and Latinx immigrants are most at risk.
And this creates that climate of fear you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. When schools, hospitals, courthouses feel unsafe, it deters people, immigrants, and sometimes citizens alike from accessing essential services or participating in civic life. It creates a chilling effect that spreads through communities.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's incredibly clear, isn't it? Public opinion on these deportation policies is really complex, deeply polarized. It's not uniformly opposed, but there's definite sensitivity to the human cost.
Absolutely. It's far from a simple picture.
And the ramp up in deportations isn't just talk. It's a reality backed by huge funding, ambitious targets, and expanded powers.
The mechanisms are definitely in place for a significant escalation.
And the consequences we've discussed, socioeconomic, humanitarian, are just profound. Family separations, potential job losses, the impact on Social Security, the strain on civil liberties, it's a lot.
It really touches almost every aspect of society. And it raises a crucial question, maybe for you, the listener, to think about. How do we as a country balance these goals of national security and enforcement with the very real, very deep human and economic costs involved? What does it really mean for a policy or a bill to be called beautiful when its impact is viewed so drastically differently by different parts of society? It's something worth reflecting on.
That's a powerful thought to end on. We really hope this in-depth discussion has given you a much clearer, more comprehensive understanding of this critical and ongoing issue. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring these important topics.